Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Covenant Cast. I'm Zach.
And I'm Steven.
And I am DC.
And we're here at Adepticon 2019, and we're going to be looking at the industry from a designer's perspective, so stay tuned.
You want to start?
I always try to think of a way to start it without saying, all right.
Well, let me think
How
about
often does it work?
Never. I always try, though.
All right, well, we are here in the...
Told you, it's going to be all right every time.
Covenant Cast. We are joined by our great friend, DC, David Carl. So thank you for joining us here in a hotel room at Adepticon 2019. Mm-hmm. And first of all, before we get into anything in particular, we had you on last year, and I think we were mainly God tier focused at that point, because you play a heavy role in that one. But where are you now? Give us a quick update from essentially 12 months ago. What has happened?
Well, I have shifted the work that I was doing from a full-time job down to part-time, and am now back to doing contract and freelance work, predominantly at the moment still with Steamforged Games, still doing a bit with God tier. Had the opportunity to do a little bit more on Dark Souls for a while there. We're currently talking about possibly me working on a different card game. We'll see. Maybe it'll go somewhere, maybe it won't. Cool. But also then in talks with some other folks, possibly even doing a little bit of freelance work in the computer side of things, the digital side of things. We'll see. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, people are kind of going that direction. I mean, it sounds funny to say, because obviously computer games have been going for quite a while. But I think of like Artifact and those kinds of that looking at ways that you can apply a lot of kind of the tabletop mechanics to the computer game environment, right?
I think in a lot of ways that line between tabletop gaming and digital gaming has just really faded over the past 2 decades, if we want to look at it in a big picture, but the past 5 years or so, like a lot. Like you see more and more digital games where there are literal card drawing mechanics, literal die rolling mechanics.
Isn't that interesting? So what? I've been wanting to
That's
dive into this for a long time.
Yeah.
Why did you go part time? I know the answer. It's to essentially be an awesome father, right?
Yeah, I am mostly a stay-at-home dad. My wife works, and I hang out with Lexi, Alexandra, Ruth, Carl, and nice. I build giant mega blocks things for her to destroy. I now have a new art form of sidewalk chalk.
Yeah,
that's always be designing, basically.
Oh yeah.
Living the dream. So for a quick second, there may be people listening or watching that aren't as familiar with DC or maybe didn't listen to last year's episode. So if you could give me, obviously now we know you're super dad. That's your new title. But if you could give me, because we met you way back and you were working on a little game called Monster Apocalypse, which we were big fans of back in the day in the like 2009, 2010 range. And so could you give us just kind of a brief synopsis of how you got into game design and then your journey since that, just so people have a context for, I think, the experience you bring to the table, because I take that for granted because I know a lot of that story.
That's fair, yeah.
And someone just listening for the first time being like, who's this DC cat? Probably would be helpful for them to understand that.
Yeah, I can do the quick version. And it starts even just growing up. I was very interested in games, in how games worked. I had notebooks full of game ideas for anything that I was playing, or even just something out of my head, just ideas jotted down of how, this would be a cool game, or here's some game mechanics. I designed a role-playing game with that before I even knew what a role-playing game was.
Fascinating.
Now that's something.
And found out later on, I was like, oh yeah, that's a role-playing game. And in high school, really got involved in a game club and got to experience, at the time, some newer games and some exciting stuff, or even some older games that are some good classics that introduce new concepts that are part of gaming. I went to college and became an electrical engineer, and also got a degree in mathematics. So I worked in corporate America for a while, making machines, making the programming behind displays for manufacturing equipment and stuff. And the thing that I really loved about engineering in college was, much like game ideas, it really merged the creative and the analytical. Like, I really like analysis, but I also really like creativity. And so coming up with new designs, and at one point I even started the patent application process for something, and that's a whole nother story, never mind. But yeah, creativity and analysis, and it's like, this, most of the corporate engineering stuff is really more kind of the management side of things, the incremental improvements, like just do the same thing again, but just change this one little thing, but do all the diagramming for it and all the programming for it, and just wasn't scratching the creative itch at all. So I got more heavily involved in gaming. Started doing competitions and stuff for different games.
Because you were kind of a tournament monster for a while.
Yeah, in games that you know of, and in games you've never heard of. Yeah, I played in different tournaments and stuff, and got to talking with some of the people who were working on those games. With FFG way back when for a little while.
I guess I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that was at the very beginning. Yep. And then it reached a point where I had talked to a few of these folks and had the opportunity to give some input, whether it was in a playtest capacity or just kind of a informal consulting capacity. Started actually working on playtesting and game design and development. I think the first contract I had that was actually for money, however small it was with the company Twilight Creations.
Okay. Yeah. What was that one? What game was it? Or system?
I worked a little bit on... the thing I worked on the most was a game called When Darkness Comes. Okay. That probably no one's heard of, but that's okay. It's not known among kind of the card gaming, miniatures gaming world, really, but it was kind of almost a light RPG. Okay. With a Yahtzee-ish dice mechanic. But it was kind of writing RPG adventures and coming up with new mechanics and characters. But yeah, that was a long time ago. That was probably about 2001, 2002. Wow. So yeah, and eventually got more and more involved with War Machine and Hordes, writing articles for No Quarter Magazine, writing stuff for organized play formats, and campaign stuff. And eventually in 2008, I think, if I remember right, went to work full-time with Privateer Press, worked a whole bunch on War Machine and Hordes Mark II, also got to work on Monster Apocalypse. Yeah. And then after Privateer Press, I tried to do the freelance thing for a little while, but as we will talk about some here, there are so many different parts of making a game, and there are parts that I am better suited to than others, and there are parts where I am willing to say other people are much better at them than I am. So I wound up hooking up with Steamforged Games after a while, working a bunch on Dark Souls, on God Tier, a bit on Guild Ball for some of the guilds there for a while. The Cooks just came out, and I had the opportunity to do the initial design work on most of those guys. So that was really a fun one.
I just saw the box. Have you seen the box?
Yeah, I've seen it.
It's really cool.
Were you involved, I think, in the Dark Souls card game as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That one came about kind of funny because I just had in my head this idea for a card game, and not really as part of the work that I was doing or anything I was assigned. It's one of the few examples of something where I just made a thing from scratch and said, hey, check this out. And it wound up being published. There's at least one other time that happened with Ninja Division, a small card game called Rainbow Knights that I should give you guys a copy of before we leave.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah. But more often you have an assignment and hopefully get to run with it. But in that particular case, I came up with the idea, showed off a prototype, and we made a few changes, of course, and then we went through play testing, and Bryce did a great job on taking that and expanding upon it and getting it developed fully. But yeah, that was another project I worked on there, and then more recently transitioning to just back to contract with those guys and with other people too.
So it seems like we've been doing a lot of content lately. We went to Gamma recently, and we talked to publishers, and we talked to distributors and retailers, and a bunch of different perspectives.
The 3-tier system. If
The
you
industry,
will,
yeah, the
right?
3-tier system. Our episode of the Covenant Cast the last time was about the 3-tier system. Jonathan and I talked about that quite a bit. But I would be curious. I get a sense that the general perception of what it is to be a designer of games, both in the practical sense and in the just enjoyment, more like
The day-to-day.
just how it goes, how you become a designer, what it's like to work as a designer. Because, again, I think a lot of us picture our favorite games, and it's like, man, it would have been so fun to work on making that game. And I think it's really easy to take for granted everything that had to happen before that moment, particularly from a design point. So any insights you have into what it is like to be a designer that might be a little different than the perception?
So I think one of the first things to talk about is like, what is game design and what is game development? And different people will answer that question different ways. I'm not putting this forward as the ironclad only answer to what that is. But for me, game design is building that foundation. What is this game about? What are we trying to do? How do we do it? How do you win? And then game development, which typically, especially for games with any high level of complexity, is the much longer part of the process. Usually the game design piece of things, just kind of putting the ideas together, trying something out, tweaking this, tweaking that, trying it out until you have kind of a foundational idea that you're going to run with, can be anywhere from just a few hours to a few days, maybe a week or two. But then the game development part of the process for a game like Dark Souls, with giant stacks of treasure cards and different player characters, different enemies, the boss enemies each having a whole bunch of different cards for their behavior deck. All of that is the game development portion of things. And that portion of things is there. I mean, there is play testing involved in there where you're playing the game to revise and refine it. But even play testing is more of a science experiment than it is a game night.
Yeah.
You're testing certain variables. You're trying to find out which things need to be changed in certain ways. You might play the same turn 10 times. The same turn. Just stop and go back and be like, okay, well, what if we do it this way? What if we do it this way?
Wow.
What if we change this number? How is it better or worse? And so there's a lot of that kind of experimentation element in my development style. In my process.
So with game design, would that be basically trying to kind of find the line as you're setting it up? In Dark Souls, for instance, we know that there's these bosses and they randomly move and kind of like... So the game design piece of that is we know we want big, like kind of significant encounters, and we know we want those encounters to be controlled by some kind of random variable.
Right.
And then do you guys, like, how far do you push that until it becomes development? Is it like, well, we're going to use cards? Is that still design? Or
Well, I think other pieces of it is, well, we want to have these battles on individual tiles, and you're going to progress from tile to tile. Your characters are going to get better as they go, and so you're able to take on bigger and bigger challenges. We know, and working with an IP and somebody else's intellectual property is, of course, different from doing something original, because then you've got to say which parts of this IP are we going to try to simulate and which parts are we going to abstract. And you see out there when you play a game that is based on any IP, even just walking through the halls here or at any game convention, you can see the ones that took more of a simulationist approach or more of an abstractionist approach. You've got everything from games that have some artwork on it but are basically gin rummy, to games that are so much of a simulation.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah, so much of a simulation that you're
so
tracking.
much of a simulation that why would you ever play this with cardboard and paper when you could just go on your computer and be done in a tenth of the time playing a whole game as it took you to set this nonsense up. Like, you got to find the right balance and find the right elements that translate well to different mediums. Do you feel like I'm a little bit off track? Oh, but the line. It's not a hard line, but it's usually when you have enough nailed down that you can start really start making different components. Like, okay, well, we have this one deck of boss behaviors that's kind of doing what we want, and it's working. The movement is functional on a tile this size currently with this many spaces on it. Now, you might wind up adding a row of spaces or changing some of those behaviors, but you have to get to that point before you can even really think about this boss's behavior and this boss's behavior and on and on. Once you go from we have it working in the micro to now we're going to flesh out the whole game, that's kind of the break point.
How much does, because you almost make it seem chronologically like design happens and then development happens. My assumption is that as you develop, though, that'll spark
tweak this
ideas or changes or necessary. Maybe you can't get a mechanic to work that you thought was going to be super cool down the line. But how much does that, it seems like kind of a simultaneous process. And
yeah, or at least an overlapping one.
Yeah, it's like a lot, maybe even curves where it's like a lot of design up front, and then like slowly it gets less and less design and way more development happening.
Yeah, and then maybe some little blips of we need a little extra design in here. This isn't quite right.
How often does the development process like significantly change original intent?
It depends a lot on the game, because I mentioned that I've now had the opportunity to work on a couple of games where I had this game idea that eventually became a game. And that's one way that things happen. But at least in my experience, it's not remotely the most common way, at least not for people who work for a game company and they have IPs that they know they can work with. They've made licensing agreements.
Yeah.
Or they have their own IPs that they want to build on that brand and make additional games. The card game Shadow Games is the first thing I worked on with Steamforged Games. And they already had the world of Guild Ball, and they already knew they wanted a small box card game that had some bluffing elements to it. So it's like, okay, so I've got to incorporate the Guild Ball world, got to incorporate, I have to keep the game simple enough to be a small box game. I have to use a bluffing element. Like the number of pieces of it that were already kind of nailed down in the design, how much of the foundation was already there when I got to it, meant that the aspects that could change and couldn't change were different from, very different from just an idea that I came up with and I tried something and saw what worked and what didn't.
Yeah.
What do you think is it seems like it makes sense, right? If you think about a game company and a designer working at a game company, it's unlikely that a game company is going to say, hire 3 or 4 designers and say, make whatever you want, and then we'll sell it.
We're behind you.
Yeah, I've never seen that happen.
Right? So I think that's a common misconception, right? Where it's like a designer is just like, I had this genius idea for X-Wing, and we should do it. Right? And it's give and take. Like I don't know where the idea, and I'm sure it comes from, sometimes maybe a designer does. Like you had an idea for a game, and it was like, I'm already here.
Right.
But how much do you think the external factors affect what the designers are getting to work on? All the way down to the retailers and distributors and even just the people who are running the publishing companies?
So there are a lot of pieces of that puzzle that come together to make a game. I was just kind of implying some of this aspect of it with talking about, oh, hey, here's what we want you to make. So that's the company's creative director or creative team, or it might even be driven by their contacts with a publisher or with a licensor. But in some way or another, the creative of the team is interacting with the game design and development team. You've also got the marketing folks that are interacting. You've got art. You've got graphic design. You've got things. You've got production. It's a huge element of it,
right?
Because you come up with something and for the concept in your head, you can have, oh, well, we're just going to have every single die is going to be custom cast and they're all going to be different. And we're going to have we're going to have a set of 5 different dice each for 20 different characters. And the production guy goes, you just your dice. We're going to have to charge $120 for this game. Like, it's an extreme example,
sure.
but how many miniatures are in it? How many parts are each miniature? How big are they? How
What's all
many
this gonna
dice?
weigh?
How much wood? What's it going to weigh? What's box size is it going to fit in? What size cartons are those boxes going to fit in? How many in each? How many of those fit on a pallet? How many of those fit on a there's so many aspects of it beyond just the guy making the game.
Yeah.
And what a lot of people talking about, like Kickstarter and independent game design and development, what a lot of people don't realize is that all those other spokes or whatever shape you want to imagine, I put myself in the middle because hey, the sun revolves around the earth, right?
Yeah.
That's just how it goes. But just from my own perspective, seeing all these different pieces of the puzzle and how important they are, because I've had the experience of talking with other game designers and developers. I was in a design development club almost when I lived in the Seattle area. There were a lot of folks that did independent game design and development there and got to see different things and hear their stories, or people I met at conventions and such. And you see these games where the concept is great, the rules are great, it's fun to play, but they didn't know how to do the marketing piece. They didn't know how to reach anybody. And so the game sold 100 copies on Kickstarter and 20 of those were to his mom.
Yeah.
Not a real example, but you
Sure.
get what I'm saying. Or they did really get the name out there. They got on a bunch of different podcasts and they went to a bunch of different conventions before, but they had poor art or poor graphic design. Like that's one of the ones that I think it certainly can. That's one of the ones that I think is possibly the one people forget about the most or don't think about the most. Like you notice bad graphic design the moment you see it.
Yeah.
But when you see good graphic design, you don't say that's good graphic design. You say, ooh, I might like this game.
Yeah.
And then you dig deeper. Like that graphic design piece of it can be such a barrier. Like bad fonts, inconsistent sizing, bad card framing, like all of that is
I've
so
just missed
important.
tons of games for those reasons. Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that, because even just walking around in Adepticon, like, so we'll do the tour, right? And all that we're doing is like, let's see if there's anything that catches our eye that's interesting or that maybe our audience would like to know about. And you can just skip by at least half the things right off the bat, because it's just, you see, like you said, or the font works weird, or the layout's bizarre, and it's like, this doesn't look like a quality product up to the level that that we're looking for. So you just pass it by, and that's such a shame, because the mechanics underneath could be phenomenal.
Well, and on so many levels, editing is one that I certainly care about. You open up that rule book for the first time, or these days possibly download it. And start looking at the game, and you read the first few paragraphs. Maybe it's just some sort of fiction about what this game is about and this world that they're trying to bring you into. And you notice like 3 typos and bad punctuation in the first paragraph, and you're just like, oh, I can't do it.
Yeah.
Maybe the game's amazing. Maybe the art's amazing, graphic design's amazing, the creative direction was amazing, all of it. The marketing usually the same people are writing stuff at a company, but maybe the marketing's amazing. But you get there and there's all these possible barriers. So many things that could be keeping people out from a good game. And then of course the gameplay itself, which is the game design and development, is definitely a component. It's just not what's on the cover of the book, so to speak, that you can't judge a book by its cover. It doesn't stop anybody from judging the book by its cover. You just say you can't. You do it anyway.
It's so strange. We've talked about this many times, where it's like all of those things that you mentioned, the spokes, get you down to the one thing that then either makes or breaks the entire journey, right? It's like you have to have all of these things right to get to the game. And then if your game mechanically is not that great, it falls apart anyway at
Right.
the very end. So it's like so much has to go right
Yeah.
to get a game that's super successful and enjoyable.
There's a few things there that are just kind of constantly evolving. I remember for a long time we felt like the games that would be most successful were the best games.
Right.
Like the best designed game was the one, and
That would be it. That would be all that
that's
people
it.
need.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
That's of course going to
We'd
be the winner,
discover it
right?
and we'd share it.
And that's not true. There's a million other factors, from shipping to distribution to the packaging to the marketing to the rule book to the way that it's presented at conventions and on the website and on whatever. And there's a million elements of that angle. And then so many times now it's like, because there's so many games coming out, right? I mean, there's a bizarre number of games coming out at this point. A lot of times I feel like at this point, some of the companies will. I find very few companies are doing all of it. It's like there's
so hard.
dents in the armor somewhere.
Yeah, there's always
yeah.
dents.
Where it's like, okay, maybe the game's great, but like, you didn't have product for 8 months. Like
That can be a problem.
Like Wingspan recently, right? It's like I
Right,
haven't even
right.
played Wingspan. It looks great. The components look great. The marketing was great. They had an article in the New York Times. The publisher has a good brand. They've made a lot of good games, and it's like you just can't get it. And so, like, yeah, that's another
Right.
element that's hard, and
I
it's
think
not easy.
It's just difficult. I think this is the industry itself is very difficult to get it all to work correctly, it makes me wonder about, as far as game design, like if you have all of these external factors, and I've been a part of, we're a very small company by comparison to all companies, but in the industry itself, we're pretty small. But even I understand like that the external factors that you're talking about, the different departments, if you will, that are having input on something, that tends to create a lot of the same kinds of games, right? Like, if distribution can only be done this way, if production is saying we can't do this fancy thing that you want to explore, if marketing is saying it has to be this cost, if so-and-so is saying the box size can only be so big, how do you not end up with very similar games throughout the entire industry, right? When is somebody willing to take a step and say, we don't care how many pallets it takes to ship this thing. It's exciting and it's new and we're gonna believe in it.
I think that there's definitely some risk there, but I also think that you can always find something different too. Like, the gameplay doesn't have to be restricted by the box size. Gamelin Games has made how many games now in their tiny epic box size, and they're not all the same. And other companies on occasion even are using that same box size, and their game is completely different as well. So that it can be shelved together, and it can be optimal for the retailer because they're not using a ton of space. But it's a very different game experience in each one of those boxes. Even just there was a game design challenge or contest. I don't remember who put it out, but it was, you have a 52 card deck of cards, make the best game you can.
Very cool.
How many games have already been made with a 52 card deck? How many games have already been made with the exact same standard 52 card deck of playing cards?
A lot of those.
Yeah, it's
Right.
still more probably. I mean, infinite.
You could make plenty more.
right?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of speaks to the innovation being born of restriction, right, or limits, where
Right,
even
right.
when you get handed, this is the size we're looking for, this is the style of game we're looking for, this is the IP we're basing it on. This gives you parameters to then kind of go crazy creatively inside of that. But one thing I wanted to kind of loop back around to is from the designer perspective, because I'd be curious to get your take. We were talking about earlier, you kind of do all these other things to get to the meat of it, which is this game great, right? So, in your opinion, what makes a game great?
Again, it's the type of thing that's going to vary depending on who you ask. But for me, it's the right mixture of things that are familiar in a positive, fun way and things that feel fresh and innovative. What it's probably a dated reference at this point because Chipotle mayo isn't quite as big of a thing as it was when they were slapping it on everything for a few months.
Yeah, Chipotle was all over there for a while.
Right.
Everything was Chipotle.
Maybe now it's avocado. I don't know. Maybe that's already over too. But a friend of mine called it the Chipotle mayo game, where it's familiar. It's mayo that your mom's been putting in food salads forever or whatever. But it's got Chipotle. It's different. It's new. And it's a good way to put it, because if the game is too new and too foreign, a lot of times people will subconsciously put up barriers to it. Like, I can't play this game. It's too complicated, or it's not for me, or I don't understand it. But if it's too familiar, it just feels bland. It's like, I feel like I've played this game before, just with different artwork. And you see a lot of that too. So you got to get the right amount of mayo and the right amount of Chipotle, and you got to have something that's familiar fun with something that's new and exciting. And I think if we look at like the big successful games from the past few years, we can point out the familiar fun part and we can point out the new exciting part.
So if you're ultimately correct in that, the industry or game design within the industry can only move so fast without alienating consumers, essentially.
I don't know if I would have said that, but when I hear that out loud, I agree.
I think that's
that's
a
what you
well-known
said.
theory too, is that just any kind of technology, or if you move too fast, you miss too many people. So you have to kind of, what is it? There's a famous thing about
Steve
this.
Jobs talked about that.
Was that Jobs talking
Yeah,
about
it was
it?
basically like saying that, if we designed the phone that we fully envisioned, it would actually be far too advanced for what people are ready for.
Right.
And how much, because it's like they wouldn't even understand or comprehend how useful this is or how to use it. So we have to stair step them. Like year after year, we have to take them closer to what we're envisioning.
Well, and that particular technology has already moved so fast.
Yeah.
That, like, there's plenty of settings on my phone. I don't know what they do.
Well,
like, it's already moved so quickly,
yeah.
and the amount of power that's in that tiny black box is just incredible.
Well, and I think a weird example, like I took that for granted because I've always had an iPhone. Like, and I use iPhone, and like I just know how the system works, right?
Right.
Like it's the familiar. And my wife had always had Samsung, so she moved to iPhone recently, and she was just like, couldn't take it.
I just don't know.
Yeah, it was just like, why does it work like that? And I'm like, well, that's just how it works. Like this is easy. And it was just like, it was almost like, someone who had just never interacted with a phone, and she's
Right.
definitely interacted with a phone, but it was just like,
yeah.
what is even happening?
It'd be like me
here?
going from my flip phone to the phone I have now.
It'd be a huge
Back
leap.
like 10, whenever that happened, 15 years ago.
Like
I
your
would have been
Razor
like,
to now.
But now I know how to use it just fine. And that begs the question, in that analogy, is there a place that tabletop game design is ultimately moving toward? Right? Is there a zenith, a pinnacle, if you will, that you're trying to get to?
Well, I mean, to take it back to the phone, I don't think you can ever fully understand or necessarily accurately predict what that's going to be. Like, if you look at the phone from 40 years ago, and then 30, and then 20, and then 10, and then now, like, at each of those points, it's so different. Like, if you didn't have that 10 years of change in between, it would just seem mind-blowing. Like,
Yeah.
I know, I'm old. But growing up, you have this big old phone plugged into the wall, connected by wires to this big tape recorder that can get your voicemail. And it's like, you've now compacted all of these devices, plus something 1,000 times more powerful than your home PC, plus something better than your home video game console of that time, onto something that big.
Plus something better than any video camera or photo equipment at the time.
Plus a personalized mail room that can send your letters anywhere you want
Yeah, it's
them
pretty
to go.
crazy. I mean, it's
Like,
wild, especially if you go
it's
back 50 years.
ridiculous.
And you would say we wouldn't have gotten there unless, like, we can't see that far. We have to stair step up, kind of look over the clouds and be like, oh, maybe this is the next place. And then get there and look over again and say, oh, no. this is the place.
Like trying to imagine that 40 years ago, going back and handing someone an iPhone.
Yeah,
like
they would have lost it.
they wouldn't have understood what was going on.
Yeah.
What sort of weird trick is this? Because that's not even possible.
So I think maybe more pertinent of the question asked, because the familiarity thing may really just be that if you want adoption of your game, you have to give people enough to latch onto that they're willing to explore the unknown, right? And so maybe a way to frame a question, I think you were almost getting at this, which is like, so let's think about the industry in 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. What is going to need to change from the game design angle to get us, because I don't necessarily think it's a zenith, like we had checked the box and we're done.
Right, we get there.
Right.
We've arrived.
Yeah,
This
I
is
mean,
the perfect
maybe
game.
we'll as games we will have reached enlightenment, but I imagine it'll keep evolving and changing over time in ways that are challenging to predict. But we start even looking at the next 5 or 10 years. Do you see any shifts in the actual design of games? Because a good example of this to me is the fact that a game like Wingspan can be as insanely popular as it is and sell out as quickly as it did. I think you go back 20 years, right? We get to the late 90s, and you put that game out, not a chance.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I also think that what we perceive as massively popular is also something that's changing and evolving.
Sure.
Or even just popular enough to print. Like one of the things that I think doesn't get enough credit for how much our industry has changed, and the fiction writing industry as well, not that we're talking about that, but is the ability to print on demand. Whether we're talking about games, books, like so many different possible creative endeavors have been so enabled by that. If I wrote a book and wanted to see that book in my hands 20 years ago, that would have been a challenge. I would have been photocopying manuscripts and sending them to publishers and hoping that someone would pick it up. Now, it doesn't even matter what's on the pages. You send the pages to the right website, pay them 15 to 20 bucks a copy.
You got yourself a book.
You got yourself a case of books.
Yeah.
Like anybody can print a book now. Anybody.
Well, and anybody.
And the same is true with games, like
Sure.
especially card games. You can get a whatever you want on it, front and back deck of cards printed for so cheap now. And if you're willing to do even a small print run, the concept of doing a print run of 100 games is totally doable now. Even
interesting.
easy. But 20 years ago, if you had a game idea, you would have to pitch it and find someone who was willing to take it and maybe make concessions. We were talking about game design and all those other factors and how much they play in. A guy that I knew who was in that game development group that I mentioned, he had made a game, had prototyped it, had play tested it, had brought it to a bunch of different conventions, revised it, and he started pitching it to companies. And his concept for the game was the world was ending, the very, very last human, an old woman, was dying, and the robots were trying to make her a garden of flowers made out of crystals. And that was his game. Now, there's not already 20 of those on the shelf. I mean, if your game is there's some fantasy creatures and they're battling each other, like, okay, we know what that is.
Yeah.
But he had the game. The game was done in his estimation, and he started pitching it. And a company said, "That is a fun game. We'll buy that game. We're redoing the artwork and the theme. We are going to I do not know what they were going to change it to, or even if he knew what they were going to change it to. But we need a new theme." And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And so rather than it getting picked up by a major publisher, or maybe a medium publisher, I don't know, and having somewhere between 1,000 copies printed and distributed to maybe 10 or possibly even 15 or 20,000 copies printed and distributed. They did their own small print run and their own small Kickstarter, and they made the game they wanted to make. But you've got to be willing to make the trade-off.
Yeah, sure.
But that's a choice now.
Yeah.
When not that long ago, it wasn't even an option.
Mm-hmm. This kind of disruption has been happening in everything.
Yeah.
I go back to music. I think about whenever I remember I had friends in bands, and they were talking about how now that everybody's on MySpace, and then it was now that everybody can put an MP3 album, and now it's now that anybody can get a song on Spotify. Like, there's so much when the creation of something becomes so much easier.
Right.
You get the freedom for creative folks to publish those things, but there's also just an explosion of quantity. Mm-hmm. There's just a lot more that goes out. And so I wonder about games. I've been working with my dad here recently. He's an author, and he started writing 35 years ago, right? And to get him to where he is now, understanding the way that the economy and the manufacturing of things works, it's so entirely different from what he's used to.
Right.
That I'm having conversations about what you have to do right now is build your personal brand, because people need to understand that you're an author they want to follow and be a part of, so that whenever you do release a book, they'll buy it. And he's used to the old paradigm, which is like, my book got picked up by a publisher, they'll do all the marketing, they'll get it distributed, they'll do whatever it needs to do, I'll cash my check and move on my next book. And so do you see a future where game designers will be in a similar situation, where it's about following DC and following Eric Lang and following Richard Garfield, and then they will just send their game off to Amazon Direct Game Publishing and ship it to whatever customer is ultimately going to be on their receiving end?
Possibly. I think the amount of that we already see is and comes from different directions, right? Mm-hmm. You have games that are promoted by who did the art. Like, that's what's in the marketing materials, that's what's front and center on the Kickstarter, is who it was who did the art for this thing.
Yeah, interesting.
And then you have ones that are who did the game design for it, where that's used as more of the marketing tool. How much people use that and how much they'll use that in the future, it's hard to say. Mm-hmm. I don't feel like it's really changed that much in the past couple of decades, like since I've been paying attention to it. Mm-hmm. 'Cause you had, after Magic, of course, you had games promoted as having Richard Garfield's influence.
Sure. Yeah.
Repeatedly.
Even now with Keyforge,
right.
Very recently.
And even now, that's one of the examples that I think is a strong example, is his name holds weight. And now not just with that original community, but with other communities who've picked up these games in between that were games by that he made that they enjoyed. But a lot of companies aren't looking for that. They aren't trying. It's not in their best interest to build the brand of, well, I'm going to go ahead and use myself as the example.
Come back to the center.
Yeah, come back to the center. Like, for Privateer Press, would it have made sense to promote the games I worked on as games by me?
No, yeah.
I understand for you, it would be great.
For me, it would have been great.
But it's like they wanted to be associated with Privateer Press. They want their brand to get the equity off of it being a good
because
production.
then the other thing, assuming those things are good and people like them, it's associated positively with the company as a whole. Mm-hmm. And so these other things, whether I've worked on them or not, get that association. And then when people inevitably change their job at some point, even if at some point everybody dies, yes, let's be morbid. Yeah. You have the equity in your company rather than the equity in the individual. Mm-hmm. And there are people who have that as part of their contract. Because one thing that we're kind of skirting around, but I want to say directly just for everybody out there, is there's two main ways that games get made. There are people out there who their full-time job, working for a company, usually in that company's headquarters of some kind, sometimes remotely, but usually on site, who design and develop games all day long. And then there are far, far more people who are not at a game company, not being handed specific assignments and licenses and whatnot, who are just being creative, making games. For most of them, it's not even their full-time job. It's just something that they do, something that they enjoy. And then those games go on, ideally, to get published by one of the publishers in our 3-tier system, or self-published.
Yeah.
Or, of course, the semi-self-published, semi-financed by the customer's Kickstarter option, which sometimes works better than others. But with those different possibilities, it changes how that process itself happens.
Yeah. And I would even offer a critique of my own question, which is, it seems like there's so many more different pieces involved in creating a tabletop game than there is in, a softcover book.
Oh,
that
sure.
it would be difficult for a single person to be able to do all of those things well enough to create a game that could compete with what a current publisher could do, right? Whereas, with authors, if you don't have that text of the book, you have literally nothing. I mean, there's no reason to put out a cover without that text.
You could have a good enough cover, you'd sell books.
You probably could. I guess that's true.
A completely blank book.
Well, there are those books, right? There is a blank book. What was that book that came out? It was like a gag gift. It was like a 300-page blank book.
I would call it a journal. Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, no, it was like a joke. I don't want to make my fake joke because it could come across like the example of what it was kind of like. I won't go there, but
we don't have to worry about the authors. Don't have to worry about box sizes and miniatures and rules manuals.
I recently bought a book, and I've bought games like this, I guess. I recently bought a book that had an incredible cover. It was a Moke book.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So the artist actually of the art on that book should get a credit for the sale of that book. But with games, I mean, I think that's the trick, right? Where it's like the design is one phase, the development is another, which we kind of broke down. But then it takes so much more to successfully get a game to market. And it's one thing to know this was designed by Richard Garfield, right? But without Peter Atkinson and Wizards of the Coast and the way they handled it, Magic wouldn't have been what Magic is. So
and there's a lot of other names that
aren't even listed,
could be,
right? I mean, you go down so and to be fair though, he's at least been lucky enough to be associated with this many incredibly successful, amazing games that I love. But at the same time, it's almost, I definitely understand the creator wanting to be credited for the work of designing and developing a game. But I'm almost coming to realize that we're maybe talking 10 to 20% of the whole effort of a successful game.
Yeah.
Is that piece?
Is that fair? Actually, what do you think the percentage is, right? Because there's certainly what does it take to get somebody to buy a game? And then what's it take to get somebody to love a game?
Well, and then how are we defining percent? Are we defining it in raw minutes that went into the effort?
That's fair. Yeah.
That's one way to put it. Or are we defining it in almost like breakthroughs?
Yeah, sure.
Well,
I think in gaming in particular, I think there can be some breakthroughs in graphic design. I think there can be some breakthroughs in editing, coming up with a way to organize this information that's so much better. Certainly there can be in production, figuring out, hey, if we change just these 2 tokens to be a millimeter smaller on each side, we can eliminate an entire token sheet and sell the game for $24.99 instead of $29.99, which will whatever. Yeah. And of course, there's going to be some sort of innovations and breakthroughs in designing the game, coming up with, for me, it's often in the shower for whatever reason. That is when I come up with that is the thing. That is the thing I was missing. We need to change this element to this so that this will all work more smoothly, so that it'll all be easier to understand, or even in how to write the rule book, in how to balance some element with another and still have it be fun on both sides of the table, which that's often one of the toughest things. It's easy to make something feel fun when you're doing it. it's a little harder to make something feel fun when you're receiving it.
Yeah.
And that's a fine line to walk. We could probably spend a whole episode talking about Keyforge and elements of that game that are cleverly designed to make both players have fun.
It's a very cleverly designed game.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So that's where, like, to me, the whole percentage conversation, obviously, it's very granular and nuanced, but it's less about the time spent and more about the impact on the overall success, and success being defined both as getting it to market, being financially successful, and then being enjoyed by the customer. Mm-hmm. Right? Because, like, in the short run, it might be financially successful for a company to, the book as an example. I bought the book, but, like, that author, the next time there's a book, I'm down. Like, there's one
that
book.
artist,
But that artist, I looked up, and it's like, if I could have bought a print of that art, I would have, right? That kind of a thing. So, to me, it's less, because I know the author took 50 times longer to write the book than the artist took to do the piece, I'm sure. But again, I ended up not buying the book because of any of the 300 pages that were in the
That's pretty
book.
fascinating. And here's so just food for thought here, and I think this is kind of the last round the horn we might get on the cast, is I was thinking to myself, as we were talking just now, that the only factor that will actually allow somebody to love a game is if the design itself is good, or if they love the design. If the design falls flat, it doesn't matter how good the art is. It doesn't matter how good the marketing was. If you open it up, sure, you bought it, so maybe it's a financial success. You got a lot of people to buy this thing. But if nobody's going to be talking about it the week after,
Right,
because they didn't have a good time playing it, then that's a thing that only game design itself can factor into. And I was thinking about that, but then I thought to myself, I'm here at Adepticon 2019, and I see a tremendous number of people who are playing games with mechanics that make no sense, or rule books that cannot be understood, or like things that are horribly imbalanced. But it's because they're painting figures, putting them on a table with giant stacks of terrain, and enjoying what is essentially a living art project for hours, right? And it doesn't matter that the game design itself is potentially what I would call, like, insufficient or just under the curve, because it's an opportunity to enjoy the art of the universe. And so you can actually fall in love with something just for the art alone, even if the design of the game is not necessarily great.
I've got two more curveballs to add to that.
Please do.
One is inertia. Like, there are games, whether it's miniatures games that we're talking about, or classic board games, classic card games, that people will keep playing them because they play them, because they know how to play them, because they played them.
That's totally true.
In the past, because they played them as a kid. They'll introduce their kids to them. Some of these games that are not great games, there's plenty of better games out there, have enough inertia to just keep selling and selling and selling and selling. Which eventually it'll run out, but that could take a very, very long time.
Yeah.
And the other piece is just the subjectivity of entertainment.
Sure.
Very few people are going to have the exact same 5 movies in their top 5 movies, or 5 books in their top 5 books, or 5 games in their top 5 games. People come to it for different reasons and enjoy different things. I played a game just this morning that the other 3 people at the table enjoyed immensely, and I will never play that game again because it had an element that I found unfun and that I found disruptive to the design itself of the game, which, granted, I'm a weird example, but in this case, I didn't like that the game was based around this core concept and had too many cards that kind of broke the ability to bring that concept to the front and bring that concept to life.
So you actually mentioned something that I think my kind of last thing to input here, I guess.
Sure. We're about there.
Is, you mentioned the subjectivity of entertainment and the fun, and I think that's what another thing for me that's kind of evolving the past couple of years. I used to assume, a well-designed game was balanced, right? And the more I'm actually, maybe it's just getting older, maybe it's a change of perspective or whatever, but like...
What do you mean by balanced? For those listening that may not even
Sure.
know
So,
what a balanced game would refer to.
Balanced would be this idea that like, no matter the position you take in the game, right, you have equal chances. So when we play Monopoly, as an example, to me it's a pretty balanced game, right? We start the game, we have
All
equal
the pieces
odds
move the same.
of what's going to go on. And a lot of these games that we're talking about, you bring your own pieces, and so balanced would be no matter the pieces you string together to play, nothing is so overly just likely to win that's unbalanced, right? It's
Right.
Bringing, it'd be akin in chess if you could bring all queens in the back row. It's like, well, the queen is unbalanced if that was how that was built, right?
Yeah.
But it kind of gets to the next thing for me, which is, even I at Adepticon, and like I have a history as a card gamer, right? Admittedly, those are the kind of games I enjoy, right? I can sit at a table. I don't have to put any models together. I don't have to paint. I don't have to build the terrain, etc. But
that you're saying have to definitely identifies you as a card gamer.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like in my mind, right? I understand it's my perspective, but what I'm coming to appreciate is that, we were passing earlier these people with these gorgeous terrain and models, and then I look over and it's like they all have this like 300-page hardback rule book, and like as someone who rarely reads the rules anyway, 300 pages of rules to read is like, I'm just on the ground. Like, I'm just like, I need somewhere to sit, right? So the reason I say that, though, is that I have good friends who trying to solve a 300-page rule book is fun.
Right.
Putting models together for days and painting them like for months is fun, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, more and more, I'm judging a game's design not on balance, right? But on how much fun is it creating. And fun and entertainment value are subjective in that it may not be for you, may not be for me, but like essentially the amount of fun it can create to the people playing, I think is the real sign of incredible design.
So we could probably spin just what you said there into like 3 more podcasts. Because you talk about a game being balanced when all players start from the same position and have the same possibilities. Like symmetrical game design versus asymmetrical game design, 2 entirely different creatures. And that has a huge impact on how much time you spend on that game development piece of it. Asymmetrical game design, you will wind up, if you're like me anyway, you will wind up with a giant epic spreadsheet with thousands of cells cross-referenced and calculated to try and make it so that everything is as fair as possible, but not so samey that it's boring. Like it's such a challenge.
Do you, I have to ask this, sorry. Do you, I feel like so much with the games I particularly enjoy, that design is being so restricted because it's trying to be balanced. It reminds me of the game The Mind that we play. Mm-hmm. I don't remember what the rule is, but there's a rule that's like, you can't do this thing or it breaks the game. Right? It's like a spirit of the game. It's like, you could like do, the first person could play at 99 and then everyone else discards their cards under 99 and you only lose 1 point or whatever. And so it's like, if you do that, it kind of breaks the game, right? Yeah. So that's what I kind of been looking, like I play a lot of Star Wars Destiny. It's a dice and card game. And like, the moment I take away the like min-max tournament, what's the best, most, whatever, and I just ask the question, it's like, what would be fun to play, right? What would be thematic to play? What would be epic? What would be a cool story to create on the table, right? It's like, what team of 2 characters in Star Wars would I love to play together that were never on screen together? That kind of thing. And if everyone was willing to operate on that same line, right, where it's like, I think it would allow designers to spend a lot less time creating balance and a lot more time creating fun, where it's like, well, here's this insane new version of Vader that is probably too good. But like, it's gonna be fun, and like, as long as we're all okay with it, here we go.
Well, on one hand, it is possible, and you see it. Like, you see people who put their own, this is how we're gonna play Magic the Gathering, or this is how we're going to play Star Wars Destiny, or whatever the game may be. And they put their own personal social contract on those games they're playing and are able to have fun with it in that way and in that sense. But if it's a game that's available to everybody, it's a much more complicated thing to do to create that environment. There's things you can try to do to create that environment.
Sure.
But it's a far, far more complicated thing to do. I think one of the best examples, and we've already mentioned it, of a game that was able to do that, sort of, is Keyforged. Mm-hmm. Because if we both open a random deck and play it against each other,
yeah.
there is no guarantee of optimization. There is no perfect balance.
There's almost a guarantee that there isn't.
Right.
That it's the opposite, which is like, yeah, your deck could just straight up be way better than mine, and you may have the answer and you may not.
Well, and there's the format where you play one game, switch decks,
the best format.
play one game. Yeah, it's so
And then you
good
bid that
because-
last game. It's like, it's perfect. That's actually perfect balance that was created not from game design, from format design.
Well, and because you're taking asymmetrical game design and you're creating a symmetrical like umbrella for it to exist under for a moment.
That's
where
really interesting.
those decks aren't symmetrical, but because we're each using one once and then bidding for the last one, we've turned it into it. It's just crazy.
That's really
Yeah,
amazing.
it's really, the first time I heard about the adaptive format is what that is. I was just immediately like, this may be the best format of a game, at least a card game, I've ever seen. Like, even in constructed card games where you get to pick your deck, like Destiny, for example, if it were, we each play a game, we swap, we each play a game, then we bid if we have to go to a game 3, that immediately changes, because then I can bring my thematic deck.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a lot of possibilities there.
I've got to ask you one simple thing, and then this will be the last one, right? We got to get out of here. Is it true that there is objectively bad game design?
If we are talking about a specific audience, is there bad game design for that audience? I think that's an easy yes.
Okay.
Just to take the easiest example of all, if you're designing a game that's very much like a family game that is supposed to be easily understood by kids as young as 5 years old, that you can play with your family around the kitchen table, and you give it a 300-page rulebook,
Bad design.
that's bad design.
Yeah.
Boom. Is it possible to have bad design truly for everybody?
That is the question. Yeah.
I think it is, but you have to kind of work at it. like you have to actually try to make a bad game to make it truly bad for everyone. And even because I'm trying to think, like, if you had an entire deck of blank cards with one card that has a spot on it, and the game is flip cards, you each take turns flipping cards, and whoever gets the spot wins.
There's still a lot of
But I
people
mean,
games that are that.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds a lot like Russian roulette to me.
Like, the game of war is that, right? It's a coin flip
right.
that takes you 4 hours.
You could make the argument that war is not a game.
You could.
Like, I think it's.
But then now we're in a whole new
you're-
conversation.
you're-
What is a game?
And that's where, like, I look at it, and it's like, I look at it as a classic example is Monopoly. And it's like, to me, this is honestly, once people know like 2 or 3 rules of how you play that game, which is, if you land on a property no one owns it and you have cash, you buy it. And then as soon as you have a set of property, you build houses and then you have hotels. And because I remember, you just get to that in the game state, and it's like, well, all the property's sold, all of it's developed, and we're literally rolling dice around until someone gets unlucky and hits a property 2 or 3 times in a row.
Yeah.
And it's like, once you know that's what's going on, at least for me, I have zero fun. Some people might really enjoy that. And that is where, for a long time, I would say Monopoly is a poorly designed game.
Right.
And then you step back, and it's like, well, if someone enjoys that, I mean, in the same way, like, there's just tic-tac-toe. It's like, I don't have fun with tic-tac-toe anymore. Like, there's a right way of playing and a wrong way if you want to win. And so then it's like, But my 7-year-old niece might be playing tic-tac-toe with my 9-year-old nephew, and they're having a blast because they haven't figured it out yet.
That brings me back to something you said earlier that kind of was sticking in my mind. One of the hardest types of games to design is one that's not for you. That is challenging.
That would, yeah.
If you ask me to design a 200-page rulebook miniature game, I'm on an island. I have an idea, but it's.
But what if I ask you to design a game that is supposed to be fun for 6-year-olds?
I was a 6-year-old once. I think I can get there.
Yeah, but would you get hung up on all the ways you could make it better that wouldn't successfully make it better for your target audience?
I mean, this. I'm going to flip it back around to you a little
interesting,
bit, where it's you as super dad now. I'm sure you find yourself playing games, even very simple. Peekaboo.
Extremely simple.
Right?
Yeah.
It's you can play peekaboo with your child, and that it's fun for you at some stage, right? But understanding, you're not trying to design the next, Keyforge or the next Magic for 8-year-olds, right? But I mean, I think you could design. If I were designing for a 6-year-old, I'm just going to keep it really simple, and it's just a fun little game. But yeah,
we should try it.
Yeah,
I think it'd be so hard. Actually, I'm thinking about it. I actually think it'd be very difficult.
Maybe we'll design it. Maybe I'll design it.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about the types of games that I love, and it's I think all games should be like this.
Right.
And it's that's wrong. So
It's just straight up wrong.
being able to divorce, or thinking that you could divorce the design of a game from its intended audience, I think is something that is, that I had thought was possible, but it may not be.
Also,
I don't think it is. I think when people make a game without thinking about their audience, they fall into all kinds of traps.
Yeah.
There is a game that I will not name or talk about too specifically, but it had elements that were very real world, gritty, the names of different weapons and guns and stuff were pulled straight out of a Guns and Ammo magazine. It is what it felt like. But then it had lots of junior high humor and puns. And it's these two things do not belong together. This doesn't make a cohesive game to have it, because there is an audience out there who enjoy grade school puns and properly naming all of your different guns and ammo.
there are 8 people in that group.
But there's not enough people in that group. Exactly right.
But still, that doesn't make it bad design, because if you were designing, if those people find
Maybe
that
that was
game,
the
right?
audience.
If that was the audience.
Yeah.
But if your audience was supposed to be anyone who's interested in a combat board game,
You probably missed.
the whole board game audience you're trying to hit,
Yeah.
you're missing the mark.
That's
Because you're gonna
fascinating.
turn off one group with this, you're gonna turn off one group with this.
Well, and I think, it's worth pointing out, this is kind of assuming that the objective of design, and therefore good design or great design, is to create an enjoyable experience for a specific group. Because I'm certain at this point, as an example, there are games now that weren't designed for 8-year-olds, that 8-year-olds very much enjoy and play.
Yeah.
And games that weren't necessarily designed for adults, that plenty of adults play. I don't know.
Talking about
but
Loop and Chewy?
Loop and Chewy is a good example. I'm sure it was designed for young kids. Great game.
All right.
I've never not had fun playing Loop and Chewy. And I doubt I was the intended audience, because I think
right.
some games find their audience in the same way
Yeah.
that some books find their audience, that maybe it was written, and I think that's where it gets a little sticky for me, because I feel games are, at least design and development, particularly, and in the graphic design, art and stuff, is art. And
Yeah.
so same with books, where it's I know a lot of authors don't write books with an audience. Some do, where it's
It's an expression of
Yeah,
inner self.
there are people that go, I'm going to write a young adult novel.
Right.
And because they've read Hunger Games and Twilight, and either they love it or this is the market they're after or whatever. But I also genuinely believe there are people writing books because this is the story they want to tell.
Yeah, that's definitely true. One of the things that you see a lot of people fall into in games in particular is they make games they want to play, which there's nothing wrong with that on its own, but you've got to be confident enough that other people want to play it too, to some extent, because you take that too far, and then what you're talking about is just a vanity project.
Sure.
It's not a game that you should seek to get published. It's just a game you should make for yourself and your friends.
Well, and maybe what we've
if
kind of
anybody else likes it.
what we've maybe highlighted here is that there is a difference between, and I said it as much earlier, but good design or great design and financially successful design.
Yeah.
Right? Like a great design game may not be a success because of marketing or editing or promotion or
Because
supply.
audience is too small.
Or because the audience is too small. There's a lot of elements to that. But also, like the inverse is also true. I think it kind of goes both ways.
Well, that about wraps it up, doesn't it?
We could probably keep going.
We could definitely keep going.
That's awesome. Well,
For
maybe
another day.
We'll cut the cameras here. Maybe we can keep going. I'd love to continue the conversation. But for all of you listening and watching, thank you so much for joining us in our hotel room here at Adepticon 2019. It's been an absolute pleasure. And DC, special thanks to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank
we
you so
appreciate
much, guys, for
you
having me
taking
here.
the time. And if you would like to hear more about the philosophy of games and game design, well, look for us next year in the same time in the same place for presumably Adepticon 2020.
There you
DC,
go.
hopefully you'll be here. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep playing.